Hi, everyone. Welcome. As you join today, please introduce yourself in the chat and see who else is there with you. We're just going to wait a few moments as many people are just jumping on today. But we want to have you introduce yourself with your name and location and your congregational affiliation or organizational affiliation so we can get to know one another today and build community. Nice to see some friends joining us. It's good to see you all. We have people joining from Florida and Vermont. We have people from California and Washington State and North Carolina, Ohio, Virginia. Thanks so much for joining us today. And please continue to introduce yourself in the chat and see who else is with us today. We're really glad to have you joining us for this important conversation. And we're just going to wait a couple more minutes. We have a lot of people who are just joining us now. So we want to give people time to get on the call today. If you're just joining us, we want to welcome you and ask you to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat function. That's found at the bottom of your screen if you haven't found it yet. And please introduce yourself in the chat with your name and location. And if you have a congregational affiliation, we'd love to hear what that is as well. And we want to welcome so many of our friends around the country to be with us today. And we're, of course, here on Zoom and also streaming live on Facebook. So we have friends joining us in both places. We're really happy to have you with us today. And thanks so much again for joining us. We want to welcome you. And I'm Reverend Susan Hendershot, President of Interfaith Power and Light. IPL was founded 20 years ago as a religious response to global warming, and our mission is to inspire and mobilize people of faith and conscience to take bold and just action on climate change. We have 40 state affiliates around the country that are all working at the grassroots level on solutions to the climate crisis. And I want to thank 3 of those affiliates for co-hosting this event today. North Carolina, Wisconsin, and New Hampshire IPLs are co-hosting this national webinar for you today. So thank you so much to them. And I want to just give a brief overview of our schedule for today. We're going to start with a spiritual grounding today. And then we're going to provide a climate-focused analysis of the election outcome and an overview of climate policy opportunities. We'll also talk about IPL's policy priorities in the new Congress and with the new administration. And finally, we'll have a Q&A session and an opportunity for you to ask questions. And so as you have questions, I want to invite you to please add them to the Q&A feature. If you're not familiar with the Q&A feature, you'll see a button on the lower part of the screen to the right that says Q&A. You can click on that And that's a place that you can drop your questions in just so we can keep track of them and they don't get lost in the chat function. But for other comments that you'd like to give, please feel free to chat with one another using the chat function on your Zoom. And I want to introduce our guest speaker for today, Jonathan Lacock-Nisly. Jonathan represents Interfaith Power and Light in Washington, D.C. as our Federal Policy Associate. And he also serves as Director of Faithful Advocacy for Interfaith Power and Light, D.C., Maryland, and Northern Virginia. And in that role, he oversees organizing and advocacy for D.C., Maryland, and Northern Virginia religious communities. Jonathan tracks federal legislation on our behalf, and he also coordinates and collaborates with our other faith-based organizations and partners in DC working on climate and the environment. So we are excited to have Jonathan on today to share some election outcomes and some of what we're looking forward to in the next administration. I also want to thank Tiffany Hartung. She is our Faith Climate Justice Voter Campaign Manager. She's been very busy this fall, and many of you have interacted with her already. And she is our Zoom tech for today, and she will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A for us today. So as we start, I just wanted to share a spiritual grounding for us all as we move into this conversation today. And this is a poem that is called Again, and it is by Park No-hae, who is a Korean labor activist, poet, and former political prisoner. And this is a translation by Helen S. Kim. It's called Again. People who speak of hope are themselves hope. People looking for a new way are themselves a new way. In truly good people is already a good world. It is within people. It begins with people. Again, people are our only hope. I think that's such a beautiful and powerful little poem. And it just reminds me of the work that we've all been doing during the election season, the lead up to our elections, and thinking about hope. And people who speak of hope are themselves hope. And so here we are moving into a new administration, what will be a new Congress. But even before we think of that, I want to reflect on what we have accomplished together as we have gone through our Faith Climate Justice voter campaign in the lead up to the 2020 elections in November. And our Faith Climate Justice voter campaign had some really amazing outcomes. IPL had never engaged in a voter mobilization campaign quite like this. And we're very excited to say that we collected nearly 7,000 Faith Climate Justice voter pledges. So these were people who committed to pledge to vote their values of caring for creation and loving our neighbors. We distributed just under 17,000 faith voter reflection guides, our Democracy, Values, and the 2020 Elections reflection guide for faith communities. With in-person voter outreach limited, IPL added peer-to-peer texting to our voter outreach efforts. And we created a volunteer-driven text banking program that allowed volunteers to text infrequent, climate-alarmed faith voters in our 7 focus states. IPL has reached out to more than 250,000 infrequent voters in North Carolina, Michigan, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, Virginia, and Arizona. We had almost 1,300 voters nationally who committed to remind 3 friends or family members to vote through our voter outreach efforts. And across the IPL network, we engaged 105 volunteers who texted, joined the social media rapid response team, and wrote letters to the editor. And in October, we collaborated with Climate Nexus to commission a poll of religious voters. The poll found that American voters of faith, including evangelical and mainline Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, and religiously unaffiliated voters, overwhelmingly believe climate change is happening and are concerned about it. The poll showed that religious voters care about climate change and want to see the president and Congress take action on climate change in 2021. So we are going to have a quick poll now. And our poll question is, were you engaged in the Faith Climate Justice voter campaign? And this can be through pledging, through distributing the voter guide, asking 3 friends to vote, text banking, or any other volunteer effort. So you should see that popped up on your screen now. Were you engaged with the Faith Climate Justice voter campaign? And go ahead and vote now, and we'll be closing out that poll in just a moment, and you'll be able to see the results. And do we have the results of our poll? There we go. So 38% of you on the call today were engaged with the voter campaign. It's good to see only 2% said, "What's that?" Appreciate that. And we will be sharing some more information about how you can get involved moving forward. But I want to thank all of you who are involved in our voter campaign this year. We really do appreciate it. We are dropping into the chat box some links to some of the press coverage that we had for the voter campaign. We had both some local press and some national press. And so Tiffany is going to share some of those links with you if you'd like to read some of the stories that were generated. And you can also share these on social media to highlight that climate action was an important consideration for faith voters in the election. So we appreciate if you share those out as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan, who is going to talk to us about what is next for climate action. Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. And thanks again to all of you who engaged in this election, whether it was through the Faith Climate Justice voter campaign or through other work. Your participation in democracy is a really important part of what I do every day. So before we can talk about, what comes next, I think we just need to talk a little bit about what just happened. So in the election, I don't think I need to tell anyone, Joe Biden won. He's the president-elect, and he will be sworn in January. Unfortunately, President Trump is not cooperating with that transition, which is delaying the president-elect's transition team. So certainly that is a problem for environmental issues, for their ability to hit the ground running, but it's especially an issue for COVID relief. The President-elect Biden needs his team to be getting daily briefings on the status of vaccines, preparing for that distribution, and the fact that that's not happening is a real problem. Could we go to the next slide? So I also want to talk about what happened in Congress. You can see a pictogram of the House here. So going into this election, Democrats had 232 seats. You need 218 for a majority. And the expectation was that Democrats were going to be expanding that majority by a good bit, picking up anywhere from 10 to 15, maybe even more seats. The opposite happened. Democrats lost quite a few seats, there are still around 10 races waiting to be decided, so we don't know exactly what the final number is going to be, but it's looking likely that the Democrats' majority will only be in the range of 3 or 4 seats, which would be the smallest House majority for either party in several decades. And so one of the outcomes of that is that in the climate space over the last 2 years, we've often seen the House passing bills that kind of signal the Democrats' interest in working on climate. They're fairly big, fairly progressive bills on things like infrastructure that were designed to signal what the Democrats would be doing if they had full control of Congress. And if you were looking closely at those bills when they passed, they would often have 5 or 10 Democrats voting no. That is no longer going to be possible. For bills that aren't bipartisan to pass the House, there will need to be almost total consensus among Democrats for that to happen. Can we go to the next slide? So looking at the Senate, there was something of a similar story. Democrats went into this election in the minority, but the expectation was that there was a good chance they would be winning a Senate majority, and that did not happen. They did pick up seats in Arizona and Colorado, but lost races where they were expected to win in Maine and North Carolina. And so that has put us currently at a Senate map where we have 50 Republicans and 48 senators who caucus with the Democrats. And you see Georgia is not selected either color, even though they had races this year. That is because both Georgia races, one normal Senate race and one that was a special election, both are going to a runoff election in January. And so the outcome of those 2 races will determine control of the Senate. If both of those are Democratic victories, then it will be a 50-50 tie, and Vice President Harris will have the tie-breaking power to give control of the Senate to Democrats. And so thinking about what this means for legislation, certainly a 50-50 tie, I don't think we would see big, bold climate bills passing. But something we would see happen is bipartisan climate bills that have been stuck under Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell would have a chance to move forward. Mitch McConnell, as Senate Majority Leader, has had a personal policy of not putting any bills up for a vote unless they have support from a majority of Republicans in the Senate. And so on things like energy efficiency, on some of these infrastructure issues, these are things that have support of 10, 15, even 20 Republican senators, and would pass the Senate by an overwhelming majority if they just came up for a vote. But they won't come up for a vote if Mitch McConnell is the majority leader. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So now we can talk about what comes next. And when we think about what's next, we first have to look at the next month and a half. The new Congress won't be seated until the first week of January. The new president will be sworn in about 2 weeks after that. And so we're in this period where the old Congress, the old president are still in office, called the lame duck session. So we're taking this time to reiterate what we've been working on for the last 6 months, which is, if we can go to the next slide, the relationship between COVID relief and creation care. And so I don't think I need to tell anyone on this call that our response to the coronavirus is a faith issue, but something that we have been educating the public and Congress on is how this is a creation care issue. And one of the central places that we see that connection is the link between local air pollution and death rates from the coronavirus. We've learned that the communities that are forced to bear that unfair burden of extra air pollution are much more likely to die from COVID-19. So clearly that's an issue of justice. It's also an issue of racial justice, because disproportionately Black and Indigenous and people of color communities are the ones that are more likely to be forced to bear that burden of air pollution. So on the last point there, clean air saves lives. We've been pushing for extra funds for the EPA's Environmental Justice Small Grants Program, which is a fund that allows communities to work on some of those local air pollution sources. That's something that will always save lives, but it's especially important during the pandemic. The second bullet point there, as we think about what our neighbors need to be safe at home right now, certainly at the top of that list is running water, electricity, and heating. And so we've been calling on Congress to pass a moratorium on utility shutoffs right now. There should not be anyone whose power is shut off because they can't pay during this crisis. But we also recognize that people need help paying those bills in the long term. And so one program that helps with that is called the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP. We need extra funds in LIHEAP right now to help people pay those utility bills. And for lowering those bills over the long term, we can make homes more energy efficient. That brings utility costs down. It's good for our climate. It creates lots of good clean energy jobs. And so we've called for more funding for the Weatherization Assistance Program that helps low-income households weatherize their homes. And so the final point that we've really been focusing on in COVID relief and that relationship to creation care is putting people back to work with clean energy jobs. Before this crisis, clean energy jobs were one of the biggest points of growth in our economy. And of course, when the crisis hit, we lost so many jobs across the country, but we lost hundreds of thousands of jobs in the clean energy industry. And one way that we can really easily put people back to work is by extending and expanding a number of clean energy tax credits that are either they just expired in the last year or so, or will be expiring soon. And actually, a number of those tax credits got their start in the last big stimulus bill that the country passed with the 2008 recession. And the investments that were made in that stimulus bill in clean energy, that's really the start of the boom of solar jobs in the US. It's what made solar and wind, helped make solar and wind much more affordable. So we know that those investments have huge impacts on our economy and huge impacts on our climate. The only other thing that I'll highlight here is, surprisingly, it sounds like Congress could be passing a full budget for 2021 in the next few weeks. The expectation before the election had been that they were just going to pass what's called a continuing resolution, just continuing to fund the government at the same levels for another couple months and let the new Congress deal with a full budget for 2021. That's no longer the case. And so we'll be highlighting these same priorities, saying that whether it's in COVID relief or in the formal full budget, these are the things that our communities need to be safe, and these are the things that we need to do to build communities that better care for creation. So can we go to the next slide? So as we turn to thinking then about 2021, what will come when the new Congress is sworn in, when the new president is sworn in, there's still some uncertainty about what exactly we'll be pushing for because those 2 Senate seats in Georgia are not decided yet. But we know the broad outline of what needs to happen. And so we're going to be communicating with congressional offices And we hope you'll join us in talking about these shared faith principles, with faith as an acronym. So our faith principles: frontline, vulnerable, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities must be supported first. We need to accelerate the transition to clean energy and commit to net zero climate pollution in electricity by 2035. We need to invest in climate resiliency and sustainable infrastructure, and transition our workforce to clean energy jobs with support and job training for workers. And finally, we need to honor creation by following science and commit to net zero climate pollution by 2050. So we're still not sure exactly what the legislative agenda will be to go with these principles, but we do know already some of the things that President Biden will be able to do all by himself. Let's go to the next slide. So President Biden, first and foremost, can be reinstating and strengthening the environmental rules that were rolled back under the Trump administration. President Trump, under his EPA and Department of the Interior and other federal agencies, rolled back over 100 important environmental protections. And so we need President Biden to be putting those protections back in place. That's on things like mercury pollution. That's on things like the Clean Power Plan. And that's how we can ultimately get to net zero climate pollution in electricity, is by setting federal standards for how clean our electricity needs to be. The same is true for our pollution from cars and trucks. The president has the ability to get us to 100% clean new vehicles being sold. And finally, we need President Biden to make environmental justice a priority of the federal government. That's a big place that he can have an impact without, more than just undoing President Trump's damage, and without the help of Congress. That's where he can kind of break new ground. So he can direct the federal government to consider environmental justice in all of its rulemaking and policymaking. And he can also step up enforcement for bad actors, polluters who are using especially communities of color as dumping grounds. So that is a little taste of what we're going to be working on in 2021. And I think we have a poll here about how you would like to be working with us on that. I think might be the poll question before that one. Well, maybe as we get the poll sorted out, Susan, you can, oh, there we go. What type of advocacy activity would you be most interested in working on? And it lists some options there, so take a minute to answer that.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. While people are answering the poll question, I just want to thank you for walking us through those steps. Very important updates, and very good to get a sense of course, what the president can do by himself through executive action versus what he needs Congress to do. And we are, of course, excited that one of the things that he has pledged to do is rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement on day one of his administration. And of course, that's just the beginning step, rejoining, but then to see what he can set in motion in order to help us fulfill that that pledge to rejoin. So thank you for walking us through that, and hopefully we'll see some see some poll results here in just a moment. Great. Wonderful to see all of your responses, and I love just the idea of giving or asking your faith leader to give a sermon on climate justice, because we know, of course, that faith leaders are trusted messengers to so many people within their congregation, and if they are speaking on this, then it really goes a long way to uh, inspiring other people to take action. And so very excited to see that. Thank you so much. And I think we can stop the screen share now. Great, thank you. And so we did want to just give you a few ideas for how you can get involved with Next Steps. Of course, you just responded to that with the poll, so that was perfect, and we'll be excited to give you those opportunities. We know that Americans voted at record high levels this year, and it's clear also that climate was an important issue in the election. So now we turn our attention to calling on our elected officials to act. So we are asking you to pledge to join with other people of faith to demand that it's time to act on climate change. And the pledge has ways to sign up to get involved. And so Tiffany has just dropped the link to that pledge into the chat. We want to encourage you to click that link and go ahead and take the pledge, and tell us which ways you would like to sign up to get involved, and we will follow up with you. We're very excited that so many of you wanted to take action, as was evidenced in the poll. We're also asking you to share things on social media. So as you do that, we're asking you to share these hashtags for climate action: Act on Climate and Faith for Climate. So please, as you're sharing content on your social media, help us to amplify the faith voice on climate action. And of course, we're asking for your support for the work that we're doing to mobilize supporters all around the country on climate action. You can donate to this work at IPL, and there's a link in the chat box for that as well. And that supports our federal policy work, the important work that Jonathan is doing on our behalf, and also the ways that we are working to inspire and mobilize people of faith and conscience all over the country to take climate action. So we really are grateful for your support there as well. Now we're going to do that third poll that we tried to do as the second poll. And the poll here is, as we look to do these types of policy update webinars in the future, what time of day would work for you? We always struggle with this. We know that it's challenging across time zones to find something that works for everyone. But we'd love to get a little feedback while we have your attention here. And so we're asking whether weekday mornings or afternoons or evenings or weekends are times that work best for you. So please feel free to make your choice there, and help us as we plan to provide content and time for conversations like this in the future. So we'll check back in on the results on that in just a moment. But we did want to leave plenty of time for Q&A today, and we have Jonathan in the hot seat on this, so he's ready to go, I'm sure. But again, if you have questions, I want to invite you to use that Q&A feature on the bottom right of your Zoom screen, and go ahead and drop a question in there, and we will get to as many of those questions as we can. And Tiffany, do you want to go ahead and start us out with the first question?
Sure. So quite a few questions have come in. I've bucketed them into some categories. So the first one is around just sort of process in the Senate. And so maybe as a quick question, it's who becomes the majority leader if there's a 50-50 tie?
Sure. The assumption is that Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, who is currently the Democrats' leader in the minority, would become the Senate majority leader. All of the Democrats would vote for him, all of the Republicans would vote against him, there would be a tie, and then Vice President Harris would break that tie in his favor.
Thanks, Jonathan. There's also been a couple of questions around other partners, environmental and faith groups that IPL works with. One is sort of what are our other environmental and faith groups that IPL coordinates with around this advocacy? And another question is specific, do we work with Network?
Yeah, so a lot of our partnership with faith and environmental groups comes through a Washington table for faith and environment groups. It's got a long name. It's the Washington Interreligious Staff Community Energy and Ecology Working Group. And at that table, we have everything from denominational bodies for some Christian denominations to a number of Catholic groups that work on different issues, Jewish groups, Baha'i groups. It is quite a good spectrum of the groups that work on national religious issues.
Thank you. A couple more around the chance or likelihood that we'll see a price on carbon in the new administration. So a question about that, but also a question about, are there any Republican House members who would support climate legislation?
Yeah, so a year ago at this time, if I knew that Biden was going to be president and we would still have a Republican Senate, I would have said carbon pricing was one of the most likely things to happen on climate. That doesn't feel to be the case anymore. There's been a lot of movement against carbon pricing actually in the last year or so. Partially that has been, I think, progressive groups and members of Congress hearing more from communities about environmental justice concerns, because carbon pricing is a market-based mechanism. There is no guarantee that local air pollution would be addressed, especially for those communities that have been treated as sacrifice zones. For IPL's work and for the faith community, we have drafted a set of carbon pricing faith principles, the things that we would need to see to support a price on carbon, and it would include protections to ensure that reductions in pollution are actually being experienced by the most vulnerable communities. But yeah, at the same time that progressive groups have kind of been cooling on a carbon price, I think some conservative members who were getting close have backed away. It's not something that was presented in President-elect Biden's climate plan, so it doesn't feel like something that's top of the agenda right now. The other question on House Republicans who are interested in the climate. So there is a Climate Solutions Caucus, which actually one of our partner organizations, Friends Committee on National Legislation, the Quaker Lobby, has spent a lot of time building up. And so there are some Republicans who have listed their name as being interested in doing some kind of work on climate. I'll share that link in the chat. Unfortunately, the leader on the Republican side of that, and I think the only Republican who has put their name on a carbon price, is Representative Francis Rooney, who retired. He did not seek re-election this cycle. And so there is a bit of a hole. I know FCNL and others are trying to figure out who the next House Republican is who will take the lead on climate action.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think there's a couple more questions around the sort of the importance of bipartisan, how crucial having bipartisan support is to passing anything.
Yeah, I mean, I can say a little more on that. Um, it has been frustrating, like I said, to see the number of bipartisan bills that get stuck in the Senate. I don't, maybe a shift in the balance of power will change that. Maybe the Senate will be more interested in passing some of these bipartisan ideas. But it's also clear that we as the faith community have a particular role to play in building up bipartisan support on climate action. There are times when conservative offices are leery of meeting with big green groups where they're interested in meeting with faith groups. And so I definitely think that we have important work to play, certainly in Congress on building bipartisan support for these ideas, but especially also in our communities for making the case that action on creation care is not a partisan issue.
Thank you. A couple other questions specific to things that the Biden administration could do. So a question, should the President-elect Biden create a special office on climate change? And another question about should the administration create an interagency task force on environmental justice?
I am not an expert on executive power. Those both sound like really good ideas. I think one thing that I have seen specifically proposed, and I hope will happen, is a special division of the Department of Justice to look at environmental justice violations. Yeah, as for the others, I don't think I can speak that specifically.
So here's a very, we're still getting lots of questions coming in. There's no break here for you. So one question that is specific around trade and carbon emissions. So the question is, what percentage of CO2 emissions are attributable to international shipping by large container ships, huge oil tankers, and other shipping? What percentage is due to international air freight? Have the tariff increases resulted in a reduction in how much? How will we regulate international shipping so that the methods they're powering produce fewer emissions? Should we be lobbying to increase tariffs and otherwise limit international shipping, such as port privileges, et cetera?
Those are some great questions. I do not have many specifics on the international shipping industry. What I can say more broadly is that countries around the world, I mean, especially, the importance of China is obviously huge in global action on the climate crisis, and countries around the world were waiting to see the outcome of this election. There were reports that many countries were delaying their new commitments under the Paris Accords of how much they would be willing to reduce to see whether it would be 4 more years of President Trump or whether it would be President Biden. With all of those countries being willing to commit to more aggressive reductions in pollution when they know that the US has a president who takes the climate crisis seriously. So I think that's really interesting to think about how President Biden can also use trade policy to reduce climate pollution. That was actually a big win for environmental groups in the renegotiation of NAFTA, that the new North American trade agreement has much stronger environmental protections. And so I think in some ways that's going to be a model for trade deals going forward.
Thank you. And just a couple more here, maybe as we still have a little bit more time. So a question about with losses in the House and no expected gains in the Senate, does it not speak to the lack of interest by public overall in climate change plans or creation care principles?
So I want to be careful not to give a partisan answer here. But one thing that I've seen a lot of environmental activists talking about is the fact that we cannot separate our work for climate justice and our work for racial justice. There's been sometimes a call in climate circles to prioritize the climate because, you know, it will be the end of a lot of things that we care about if we don't. But we can't separate these two issues. Voters are thinking about them both and possibly thinking about where the country is on race more. And so we have a role to play in the climate movement to continue to push for racial justice and to explain how a platform of racial justice is good for the climate and good for the country.
And I think we've just got 2 more questions here. One, maybe a quick one. Does IPL work with or check in with 350.org?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oops. And another question around, I think we'll send out share Jonathan's contact info in the chat, and we can send that in the follow-up email as well. But another question about, will we be sharing, so thinking about advocating around the faith principles and going forward, will we be sharing out talking points or other materials that folks on this call can be using while lobbying their members of Congress?
Yes, definitely. We will send around some talking points for how you can be talking with your members of Congress on this. And also, you know, at some point in the next month, we'll have some of those legislative goals also that we'll be asking members of Congress to support.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think that wraps up. I'm just digging through all of these questions here. I think that about wraps up most of our questions here. Oh, one more. Does IPL work with the Poor People's Campaign?
Reverend Susan, do you want to speak to that? I don't know if you've had more contact there.
Yeah. And a lot of the effort around the Poor People's Campaign, there's a lot of things that happen at the local level. And so many of our affiliates around the country have partnered on events and things like that with the Poor People's Campaign. So if you are interested and you're in a state with an IPL state affiliate, and that information is available on our website, we have a map with our affiliates. You can always check in and see what the local affiliates are planning in terms of events or rallies or anything like that in partnership with the Poor People's Campaign. I know it's a little tricky now with COVID and limiting gatherings that were happening in person, but certainly many of our affiliates have been pursuing those partnerships on the ground in their communities.
Thanks. I think that about wraps up all of the questions here. Just double checking a few more places once. I think that's about it, and we're making good time. So I'll turn it back over to you, Susan. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, Tiffany, and thank you, Jonathan. Those were great questions and a great discussion. It's wonderful to have people who are so engaged and interested in what's coming and how you can be involved. And you know, one of the things I would just highlight again is that IPL works in partnership and collaboration with so many other organizations, faith-based organizations in Washington, D.C., as Jonathan said. We work with secular partners as well at the national and also at the state levels through our affiliates. And we think that collaboration and coming together around the issue is really what it takes to get us where we need to be. We're really grateful for the opportunities to move forward in partnership and support of environmental justice organizations who are speaking on behalf of their communities. And we certainly want to amplify and support their voices in the space, because so many of those communities and organizations have been left out of the conversation in the past. And so I really want to thank Jonathan and the Whisk Table group for the work that they are doing on the faith principles for a Green New Deal, the faith principles on carbon pricing, and of course the faith acronym that he shared, because we feel like it's very, very critically important for the faith community to speak to this issue from the moral framework, and to be able to say, in fact, here's why we support a piece of legislation, or here is why we don't support it, or here is how we think it could be strengthened. And so those principles have really guided our work, and we expect that they will continue to guide our work as we move forward into the new administration and what 2021 brings. So again, I want to thank you for attending today and for being a part of this important conversation. If you have other questions that come up later, or that you think of that were not addressed, please feel free to send them to us. We're going to drop the email link into the chat. It's our info@interfaithpowerandlight.org email address, and we can then direct that to the right person to answer your question. And we are always here to serve as a resource for you. And we're also going to be sharing the recording and the links from today's webinar via email with you. So be looking for that to come as well. We really appreciate you signing up to be with us today, and we want to share those resources out with you following our webinar today. And I think that is it. We want to just say a thank you. Here's how you can stay in touch with us on our website, sign up for our email list. Please, as you're sharing on social media, use our hashtags Faith for Climate and Act on Climate. We appreciate you pushing more things out into the world to your network. And I just again want to say thank you and blessings on the journey. Thanks for being here today.